I'm Mary Podlinski. For the last 7 years, my day started and ended with a small chorus of chaos. Packing lunches, refereeing sibling battles, remembering the permission slips that everyone else always assumed I'd remember. I used to be in human resources, recruiter, then HR generalist, until Curtis and I decided it made sense for one of us to stay home once the kids were small. I never stopped being competent. I stopped being paid for it. That, for better or worse, was my choice. 2 weeks ago, Curtis came home with a cardboard box and the kind of blank, embarrassed smile you only get when a corporate memo says restructuring. Mass layoffs, they told him. His team, gone. His title, gone. The box had a few framed photos, a plant he tried to salvage, and the lanyard from a conference he'd liked. He sat on the kitchen floor and looked at the dog like it might offer an answer. We ate takeout that night because neither of us wanted to open cans of responsibility on an empty stomach. Curtis started applying for anything that matched his resume, and then everything, and then things that didn't even need a resume. Interviews trickled in and fizzled. Confidence leaked out at the seams. He cooked more. He learned the kids' teachers' names. He did laundry like he'd been training for it his whole life. One evening, exhausted and honest, we had the conversation. I told him I was thinking about going back to work. HR assistant, something with steady hours and benefits. I offered that it would be temporary if that made it easier to swallow. He flinched the way people do when a familiar identity is nudged. I don't want to be Mr. Mom, he said, and then, softer, like that movie. I understood the line the way you understand other people's fears. It's not about the apron, it's about pride and the shriveling vocabulary of identity when a job disappears. I didn't press. I laid out numbers, mortgage, daycare, the way the car repair would eat the reserve. I told him I could look for part-time, that I wouldn't jeopardize the routine he'd built with the kids. Curtis chewed on a carrot stick like it was a metaphor. He admitted, quietly, that the thought of being the one at home felt foreign, and, he worried, lonely. He asked if I'd still be happy doing it. I told him I would be okay, that I wasn't leaving because I wanted to escape the kitchen. I was leaving because I knew how to do this work and because we needed the steadiness of a paycheck. There was a long pause, then a small, rueful laugh. I don't want to be Mr. Mom, he repeated, but this time his shoulders dropped and he reached for my hand. If you want to do this, Mary, do it. I trust you. I'll do anything to make this work. He meant it. The blessing wasn't just permission, it was a trade-off of pride for partnership. I nodded because there's a kind of relief in being allowed to take up space again, practical and ridiculous at once. So I dusted off my HR references, updated a resume that remembered how to sound bold, and started applying. That was the plan. Steady, cautious, pragmatic. We divided the mornings and spreadsheets and the grocery list like two people rehearsing a new dance. At stake wasn't just money. It was a small, fragile architecture of self-worth, marriage, and the illusion that we could always call things temporary until they weren't. I started at a big downtown office that smelled faintly of new carpet and ambition, the kind of place where every conference room has a polyglot of whiteboards and someone's half-finished kombucha on a windowsill. My title was HR assistant. My boss was Jamie Leigh, HR manager. 30-something, sharp blazer, softer voice. She was the sort of person who remembered the name of the contractor who'd fixed the copier 6 months ago and asked about him at the next staff meeting. For someone walking back into a career after years away, that kind of attention felt like a flashlight in a dark hallway. At first, Jamie was everything you'd want from a manager. Patient with my questions about the firm's idiosyncratic policies, generous with context I didn't yet have, and oddly protective about the kids on special schedules kind of requests. She'd linger in the doorway with a sympathetic smile when I explained why I had to duck out at 3:15 for after-school pickup. She'd bring me a fresh mug from the kitchenette and say things like, "You're doing more than enough, Mary." It felt human instead of corporate. After years of being invisible in PTA threads and playdate logistics, it felt nice, and then a little too warm. Compliments about my good energy turned into comments about how beautiful my laugh was. A hand would rest a second too long on my shoulder when she passed by my desk. She started inviting me to grab a drink after work, and when I politely declined, she would say, "Come on, it's just me and you. We could talk life," with a look that suggested she meant something more than small talk. I didn't tell Curtis. He was barely keeping his own head above water. The humiliation of unemployment, the crunch of schedules, the mental heavy lifting of being the one at home when that wasn't how he'd pictured it. He'd said he didn't want to be Mr. Mom, like in that movie. And I'd watched him shrink and then try on the role anyway, because he loved our kids and because we'd decided together that this was temporary. He needed wins and normalcy, not a new problem. So I kept the Jamie stuff tucked into the private pocket of the day. Awkward, unnerving, and something I could handle. One afternoon, after we'd been asked to stay late to finish a compliance packet, Jamie closed the door to conference room B and sat across from me. There was a single, too bright lamp, the kind that makes everyone look a little more honest than they feel. She told me in a lower voice that she'd always been drawn to women and that coming out had been the best terrible thing she'd ever done. She smiled like she was sharing something tender. Then, without missing a beat, she said, "I always thought you felt it too. There's something about you, Mary. You're different. I'm not saying you have to act on it, just that I saw it." I felt a flush of heat and a thud of panic. I told her, straightforward and shaking, that I loved my husband, that I was married to Curtis, and that I had no intention of betraying him. I said it like it was a fact and like it was a shield. "I'm flattered, Jamie," I said, "but I'm married. That's my life." Her face changed. For a beat, she looked hurt, then pissed. It was like someone who'd been offering a hand and then decided it was a trick. "So that's it," she said, voice narrowed. "You just lead me on." She stood up too quickly. Fine. I tried to explain, to say I hadn't led anyone on, that I'd been polite and that workplace boundaries mattered, but she cut me off with a smile that felt practiced. "You know how this looks," she said. "Someone could say you accused me of making unwanted advances, or that you were trying to weaponize my sexuality to get a payout. People say things." She left the room like she was leaving a stage. I sat there, stunned, hearing the click of my own shoebox-thick pulse. I could see, suddenly, how fragile power looks when it wants to be cruel. Neat desk, responsible title, the ability to make decisions about other people's livelihoods. That evening, and this is the thing that still makes my stomach drop, she called a staff meeting in the main open floor. I was halfway through documenting a training schedule when Jamie walked over and asked me to join. I thought it was to go over onboarding logistics. Instead, she made an announcement in a voice that sounded like it had been practiced while ironing a blazer. "Mary Podlinski is being terminated, effective immediately," she said, the words sharp and clinical as a dentist's instrument. "Due to a breach of trust and attempts to manipulate HR processes, the company will not be renewing her contract." The room went quiet in that heavy, where did my air go kind of way. People who'd been looking at email screens looked up. Colleagues I'd made small talk with looked downright startled. I opened my mouth to say something, anything. I thought maybe it would be a misunderstanding that could be cleared up. But the office manager, who was on Jamie's team, began to read a prepared statement about confidentiality and conduct. A security badge was offered with the efficiency of someone handing over a stapler. Somebody asked if I wanted my things in a box. Another person whispered that it was so sudden. Jamie's smile never disappeared. She said, quietly, "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior here." As if she were explaining a policy rather than destroying an income and reputation in 30 seconds flat. I walked out past desks and faces that had watched a tribunal. A few people made sympathetic noises. One or two avoided my eyes entirely. My cardboard box, the same cheap one I'd given Curtis when he was laid off, waited at my desk with a couple of pens, a stapler, and the tiny consolation of a recycling bin beneath. In the car, the tears came the way small leaks turn into a flood, sudden and impossible to control. I sat there for a long time, the engine cooling, and thought about calling Curtis, but couldn't bring myself to do it. He was shouldering enough. I told myself I'd sort it out. I'd call a lawyer, or a friend, or a parent. I told myself things that felt like promises instead of explanations. That night, I slept very little, not because I was worried about bills. I was. but because the shape of the world had shifted in a way I hadn't expected. HR had been my language, and an HR manager had used that language to write me out of the room. I called Curtis that night with my voice knotted in a way I'd never heard before. I tried to make it a gentle tone. "Don't worry, I'm okay," and failed. The truth came out in splinters. Jamie, the meeting, the way she announced it like she was reading minutes instead of ruining a life. I heard him inhale on the other end of the line, a small, steady sound that meant he was present, and then the flood broke. He didn't gasp or laugh. He became a kind of business-like comfort that surprised me. "We'll handle this," he said. "We won't let her get away with it." He wrapped himself around our little family that way. Part practical hand and part stubborn animal. He came home and took the kids to the park like a man proving to himself he could still do the things that mattered. He sat with me on the couch afterward and let me cry into his shoulder until my tears were less sharp and more exhausted. In the morning, he was different. Calm, focused. I made coffee. He made toast, and when he handed me a slice, he said, "Tomorrow, we call a lawyer. You didn't do this to yourself. You did your job." He wasn't theatrically brave. He was quiet and firm, the kind of partner that reconfigures the world by deciding it's going to be different. We found a lawyer through a friend of a friend. Small firm, hands-on, not the kind of place that would treat me like a file. Her name was Claire Mendoza. She had ink-stained hands, a laugh that made courtroom tactics sound like choreography, and a habit of saying exactly what needed saying. We met in a windowed office with a plant that had survived worse corporate climates than mine. Claire read the email threads, the calendar invites, and the HR notes Jamie had filed. She asked neutral, surgical questions and made notes in the way people do when they're building a puzzle out of evidence. What mattered was that there was a trail. The messages where Jamie praised me privately, the calendar invite where she'd asked for time to talk after hours, and, crucially, the timeline. I documented everything in a small notebook after the meeting, the exact words Jamie used, the witnesses who had seen the hand linger, or the invitation sit like a stone on my desk. Claire asked if I'd kept anything else. Text messages, names of colleagues who'd been let go after conflicts with Jamie, anyone who'd been the recipient of her concern. I had a list. There were rumors in the office like loose change, found money to the right listener. People I'd only made small talk with came forward when Claire called. Some were nervous, some quietly furious. One former employee, who'd been driven out after a similar confrontation, handed over a recording of an HR meeting where Jamie had coached them to frame it professionally when departing. Depositions felt like being unpeeled. Jamie's narrative was tight and rehearsed. She presented herself as an injured manager, defending the integrity of the department. Claire, patient as ever, led witnesses through the inconsistencies until the story Jamie needed to be true started to fall away at the seams. An intern testified about Jamie's tendency to isolate certain staffers under the guise of mentoring. A project manager spoke about Jamie inventing claims to get inconvenient employees off a roster. Each statement was not dramatic on its own, but the pattern grew like frost on a windowpane, delicate at first, then impossible to ignore. I expected rage to be my dominant feeling during the trial. Cinematic, red hot, bludgeoning. Instead, it was a slow, deep relief, like unclenching a muscle you didn't know you were holding. When the judge read the ruling, because Claire refused to let this vanish in a settlement and pushed for a judgment that acknowledged the wrongdoing, the courtroom felt impossibly small and loud at the same time. The judge's voice was a flat, measured thing that made the facts feel sharp and clean. This court finds that the termination of Mary Podlinski was conducted without sufficient evidence of the alleged misconduct, and that the actions of HR manager Jamie Leigh contributed to an unjustified and retaliatory dismissal, the judge said. He spoke about breaches of protocol, about the misuse of managerial authority, and about a workplace where power had been used to silence rather than to investigate. The firm was ordered to pay the remainder of my contract: severance, unpaid wages for the notice period, and damages to account for the professional harm. Hearing those words was not triumphant in the way the movies stage victory. There was no confetti, no parade. There was a cool, legal finality that folded into the rest of my life. I felt vindicated in a practical sense. The payment meant the mortgage would be safe and the kids' activities wouldn't sputter. And vindicated in a softer, stranger way. The knowledge that truth, when gathered and presented, holds weight. There was fallout. Jamie's reputation in the company fractured. HR promised a review, and for a brief, savage while, the rumor mill did the rest. The firm issued a statement about commitment to equitable workplace practices and paid what the court ordered. The ex-employees who testified were awkwardly grateful and private about it. None of us wanted to be heroes. We wanted to be treated like adults with jobs and dignity. When the check arrived, Curtis and I sat at the kitchen table and looked at it like a prop from a play whose script had finally been corrected. He reached across the laminate and squeezed my hand. "You did good," he said, with that small, steady pride I'd come to rely on. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't have to. Justice had been handed in a pretty dry formal envelope, and while it didn't erase the humiliation or the nights of worry, it put a bright, definite stop to a chapter that had felt dangerously open-ended. I left court different, less brittle, as if some small internal structure had been reinforced. The lawsuit wasn't a glorious revenge. It was practical and necessary, and in its own quiet way, precise. Jamie had used the tools of power to punish. The law, and the willingness of others to speak up, used its tools to answer. The thing that mattered to me at the end was not seeing someone fall, but being restored enough that I could walk into life without that small, constant ache at the base of my skull that says, "You have been wronged and nothing will change." A year later, the air in our house feels lighter, the kind of air you get after a long storm that made a mess of the trees but left the sky cleaner. Curtis found work again, back in his field, but with a smaller company that treated people like people. He likes to joke that he's post-corporate now, as if the layoff had been some philosophical rebirth instead of a firing. His laugh is bigger these days. He makes breakfast on Saturdays without irony. The kids are older, louder, and perfectly unimpressed by either of us. They remember the Mr. Mom era, as the time Dad learned how to French braid and burned every grilled cheese for a month. Curtis leans into the story when they tease him about it. He'll raise his coffee mug and say, "Hey, at least nobody went hungry." And they'll groan and roll their eyes, and he'll wink at me over the table. It's a rhythm. Domestic, humble, real. As for me, I didn't go back to that kind of HR again. I took consulting work with a nonprofit that helps people navigate workplace harassment cases. There's a strange symmetry in that. The same systems that tried to break me now, giving me a reason to fix them. When someone sits across from me, trembling and uncertain, I know exactly how their heart is beating. I know how a single person's misuse of authority can collapse an entire sense of self. And I know how to build it back, piece by piece, through facts and documentation, and the stubborn insistence that fairness is still possible. Sometimes, when the house is quiet after dinner, Curtis and I sit on the back porch. The cicadas buzz like they're gossiping about us. He'll ask if I ever think about her, meaning Jamie, and I'll shrug. "Not really," I'll say. "She's part of the story, but not the ending." And that's true. Revenge had its moment in court. Justice came stamped and notarized. The rest of it, the living, the laughing, the returning to ourselves, is what stayed. Curtis still jokes that he's retired from laundry. I remind him that his folding skills are now part of our family legacy. He smirks, calls me boss, and for a second we're just two people who walked through something awful and found each other again on the other side, a little dented, but solid. When I lock up for the night, sometimes I catch sight of that old cardboard box in the garage. The one that carried his desk junk, then my desk junk, then all our anger. It's empty now. We keep it around, I think, because it reminds us that everything temporary can be survived, and some things when you stand up for yourself can even be redeemed.